Welcome to the Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello there and welcome. Before Mark Gerritsen, before Ted Shue, and before Peter Milliken, Flora MacDonald represented Kingston and the Islands for 16 years in the House of Commons. In 1979, during Joe Clark's brief tenure as Prime Minister, she served as Secretary of State for External Affairs. But there was more to Flora than just politics. A new memoir has just been released, Flora, A Woman in a Man's World, written with Geoffrey Stevens. Geoff was a long-time Ottawa columnist for the Globe and Mail, and later the paper's managing editor. He has written books on other Canadian political players and continues with regular newspaper columns from his home base in Cambridge, Ontario. Geoff sits down to fill us in on the passions of Flora MacDonald. Here is our conversation. We are here to talk about a book that has just been published mid-October, and it's a book on someone who is very iconic in Canadian politics and close to the heart of a lot of people here in Kingston and the Islands, and that's Flora MacDonald. And the book is called A Woman in a Man's World. And I guess we should probably start by getting some sense as to how you and Flora first met.
Oh, gosh. I was a young reporter in the Parliamentary Press Gallery in Ottawa in the 60s. For the Globe and Mail, and that was at the time when Flora was at working at conservative headquarters, progressive conservative headquarters, and in April of 1966, she was fired from that job. She'd been there for 9 years. She had effectively been running the headquarters, but she had never been promoted. She had never been offered a chance to be considered for national director of the party. She had been passed over twice in favor of less experienced men, and she'd been told, "Look, we're never going to have a woman running this. There's no point even trying." And she was, though she was running the place, she was being paid less than some of the men who were reporting to her. And she felt there was some injustice there, but she loved the work and she did it. And during that period, though, she started there just about the time John Diefenbaker formed his first minority government in 1957. And then she was there through his big majority in 1958, and then watched him gradually lose power and fall out of favor and become odder and odder, in your view, more and more paranoid, obsessed, with enemies all around him, and he considered Flora to be one of them.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about the book, first of all, in terms of how it came to be written. And I know that you've been involved in writing biographies of other Canadian politicians or political backroom people, and they have been listed as being biographies, but this is more of a memoir, correct?
This is a memoir, and I can tell you how it started. In the about 2004, I guess, I had finished writing a book on Dalton Camp. And I was looking around for something interesting to do. And it always struck me that Flora MacDonald really had a story that needed to be told. I had known her, as I said, since, I guess, 1966. So I approached her and said, "Look, this is a good story to be told. You came into Parliament in 1972 as the only woman in a conservative caucus of 102 people, you and 101 men, the only one. You became Canada's first female foreign minister. You became the first woman to try to run for the leadership of the Conservative Party. There's a good story there. And you basically dedicated your life to promoting the cause of women in public life and in private life, corporate sector, what have you." And so I said, I think it's a story to be told. And so we started talking about me writing a biography. But as we started interviews and got into it, it became pretty clear to both of us that it would be a more effective story if it were done in her own words. So we decided to do the memoir format. And we did it by basically, I would go from Cambridge, Ontario, where I live, to Ottawa, and for a couple of days at a time, and tape interviews with her, go to the archives with her and look at her papers, thousands and thousands of papers from her years in politics. And then I'd go home to Cambridge and I would transcribe the interviews and go through it carefully and draft chapters. And then I would send chapters off to her. And I must say that Flora is absolutely meticulous. I went through 7 drafts of some chapters before she was satisfied that they were correct, accurate, and so on. So that's how it started. And but that was also at the time when she was getting deeply involved in Afghanistan. And she was in Afghanistan a lot of the time and wasn't available. And when she was in Canada, she was out raising money across the country to support her Future Generations Canada, the teaching institute that she founded to work with her in Afghanistan. And so it was hard to get her. And so it was a slow process. And I guess it was about two thirds done maybe when she died in 2015. And I thought that was the end of it. But I can tell you after that how it came about. But that's basically how it started.
Now, you label her as being an adventurer, a politician, and a humanitarian. Right. And I'd like to try and touch base on all three, but I think we'll start with the political aspect of her life. And she grew up in Nova Scotia and went to secretarial school. Right. And I'd like to know how she got involved in politics to start with.
Well, her father was a strong conservative. He used to take her to conservative meetings. Flora was the only one of his children who had much interest in politics. She was intensely interested, and he took her to a lot of conservative meetings. And along the way, one day when they were walking along the street in North Sydney, they bumped into this sort of odd-looking fellow in a colorless sort of suit and was sort of really shy guy. And they started talking to him, and he was Bob Stanfield, and he had just been elected leader of the Provincial Conservative Party. And her father, after that meeting, shook his head and said, there's no hope for us with this guy. At any rate, Flora got involved and with a local candidate in their area who was a conservative candidate. And the guy didn't win, but she went out and learned some of the ropes of, on the street campaigning, getting out the vote and all that stuff. And in the course of that, she got more and more exposure to Bob Stanfield, and he became quite taken with him. And she understood that he had some of the same values that she did. He was very much a progressive, more than a conservative. He was a strong supporter of women's rights, and he had all the right instincts about the role of government in helping people and not sort of holding them back.
Now, she went to work in his office, correct? At the provincial level?
No, she didn't. She worked in that one campaign, and then she started working in successive provincial election campaigns, in which every time there was a provincial election, Dalton Camp would come back down to the Maritimes, and there are people like Brian Mulroney would show up campaigning, and she worked with them in those campaigns, provincial election campaigns, and then in 1957, after the Diefenbaker, about the time of the Diefenbaker minority government, she was looking for a job. She'd been working with the Bank of Nova Scotia in North Sydney first, and then Halifax, and what she really wanted to do was not work in a bank. She didn't really want to work in politics, not as a career. And what she really wanted to do was to travel, get out. And that's one reason why she worked for the bank, because she could get transferred to different places. Anyway, she had this urge to travel. And so she went to Ottawa one day. She'd applied to the Department of External Affairs. And she had an interview coming up, taken in as a junior person in the department. And she thought she could work her way up to something where she could get some travel. And she had some time to kill in Ottawa before that appointment. So she was wandering along some of the streets south of the Parliament buildings, and she came across this funny old building called Bracken House, which is a conservative national headquarters, named after a previous, or one of their former national leaders, John Bracken. And she said, well, conservative, I'm a conservative. I'll just go in and tell them there's another conservative in town. And she went in, and as luck would have it, they were looking for somebody. And she was interviewed by a woman who seemed very impressive, but in fact was basically the receptionist. And they offered her a job. She said, well, take a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and didn't go to the external affairs interview. She took the job at conservative headquarters, and she was smarter than most of the people there, and probably more ambitious and more determined. And she gradually assumed more responsibility there. They were glad to have somebody who liked to do a lot of work, and she did.
Now, initially, she and John Diefenbaker did get along, correct? Because she went to work in his office at one point.
Yes. She wasn't in his office, but she worked very much with him from national headquarters. National headquarters really has three functions. One is, yes, to serve the leader. One is to serve members of parliament and their relations with their constituents. The other is, serve the caucus. Help the caucus members deal with the membership at large of the party, and do what you can with assist the leader. And she loved Diefenbaker at the beginning, and she was quite taken with him, and she was quite overcome by the results of the 57 election. She was wonderful, and then she 58 his big victory, and it turned sour after that. She thought, because Diefenbaker, she thought, became less open to people, less open to the public, and more convinced that he was the person who had registered the victory. And Flora and some of the others thought that actually, if the party had stayed with George Drew for one more election, they probably would have won it. But anyway, Diefenbaker won it. But she started getting uneasy when she saw how power went to his head, and how he didn't talk to people anymore. And he said, if I stop and talk to this person, I'll have to talk to everybody. I'm prime minister. I can't do that.
When I was looking through some of the names that came up when I was doing a bit of research on your book and giving some thought to the approach I would take, a lot of names kept coming up that I had forgotten about. And now I'm a little younger than you, but not that much younger, but I do remember Dalton Camp's name and the conflict that ensued between he and Mr. Diefenbaker, one particular point. What was the premise behind that conflict? How did that all begin between those two individuals?
Dalton Camp had become increasingly concerned about Diefenbaker and the way he had changed after he got power. He felt, Dalton was somebody who believed in the party and believed that the party, that the leader was a creation of the party, not the party a creation of the leader. And he got concerned more as time went on. Then there was the revolt within the Diefenbaker caucus after the 65 election, and a number of members resigned. People like George Drew and Davy Fulton left the cabinet, and Pierre Sevigny, for what he was worth. Battle lines got drawn within the party. And Dalton Camp tried to sort of keep the peace in the party for quite a while. He figured his responsibility as a national president of the party to try to hold them together. And it didn't work. And as Camp said later, the thing that really turned him on and ignited his campaign against Diefenbaker was when he fired Flora MacDonald. For no reason. Camp knew that something was likely to happen. And he went on vacation to Eleuthera. And before he went, he had sent a message through to Diefenbaker's office and to Jim Johnson, who was then the national director of the party, that if anything happened to Flora while he was gone, it would be a declaration of war. Well, 2 days after he left, they fired her. And Camp said, well, that was it. Yeah. Basically, that was it. And they started the organization and the campaign to turn the annual, we used to call annual meeting, which is held every 2 years, doing things in politics. It's really a policy convention, to turn that one in the fall of '66 into a leadership test, and they did that. And the test was, could Dalton Camp get reelected national president of the party, or if Diefenbaker put up a candidate, would the Diefenbaker candidate win? Diefenbaker put up a very strong candidate, and Camp, very close, but Camp did beat him. And then they passed a resolution calling for a leadership convention, and that was held in September of '67 at Maple Leaf Gardens, the first great convention in my experience, and in Canada. And Diefenbaker ran, but ran very badly. And they ended up with the candidate that Camp was supporting, and Flora, which was Bob Stanfield, the national leader of the party at that point.
I'm interested to know, at some particular point when Flora got fired, she ended up at Queen's. Now, yes. What drew her to Kingston and to Queen's at that time? Do you know?
Yes, after she left national headquarters, she wanted to get a break, and she went off on a cruise in the Caribbean on one of the ships which Canada had donated to the new country of Trinidad and Tobago, which didn't last long, but Canada had donated 2 ships. And she was down there. She wanted to take a cruise on one of them. And also on that cruise was Professor Dr. Corey, who was the president at that time of Queen's, and his wife. And Flora got to know them and became very friendly. And also she had also met and knew John Mizell, who had been working on a book on the '57 election. And I guess the subsequent, probably the '68 as well, but the Conservatives had given him an office at national headquarters to work while he was researching his book, and Flora had gotten to know him there. And he was the head of the political science department at Queen's. So anyway, she met the Coreys, and she got back, and she didn't have a job, and she had some offers, various things, but Corey got in touch with her, or Mizell, I'm not sure which one this time, but to offer a job as sort of the executive secretary, or I guess probably executive secretary to Mizell in the political science department, basically the administrative person in political science, and also for the new sociology department, which they were forming. So anyway, she took on that job and worked there for a number of years. And while she was in Kingston, she became the first woman to become a student at the Canadian Forces Military College in Kingston. And she got to know people. She was asked to take over a heritage organization there to one of the things, they tried to save the Graham Theatre, and did in Kingston. They then fought off developers to preserve the waterfront. There's open public access. So what happened in Toronto with the waterfront now, where you can't even see the lake, didn't happen in Kingston. It was kept. So she was involved in these causes. She got involved with the prison for women and trying to get it closed. The old prison for women, she saw how badly the women were treated there. She got involved, and once a week she put together a group of people to go and visit with the women, and they'd organize events for them at the prison. So she got pretty well known in the community. And then while she was off with the military college on their annual tour of foreign countries, she got a message from some of her friends in the political science department. They put her name in for the Conservative nomination for the election of 1972. And she agreed, came back. She said that she was, I think she was in class when the nomination meeting started. She quickly got there. Anyway, she won the nomination quite easily. And then she didn't really expect to win the election. That had been a Liberal seat for a long time. And it had been held by Edgar Benson, who was Minister of Finance previously. But he'd retired, so it was basically an empty Liberal seat. And she went out for dinner the night of the election, and they figured there's going to be a long evening, a good meal. And they hadn't even had their first course yet. And the waitress came along and said, "You've been elected." She was amazed. I was astonished. And so she did that. And she went up to Ottawa, and And she said she'd been on Parliament Hill hundreds and hundreds of times when she was at headquarters and knew everybody there, basically. But she said her hand was shaking so badly, she was so nervous, she didn't think she could even sign the register when she was sworn in. Anyway, she was sworn in, and the 101
Skipping
men
ahead a few years, when she decides to take a run for the leadership of the PC party. So that was in what, 76?
It was in 1976. She said she would have been most happy if Stanfield had stayed on. But Stanfield had lost 3 elections, Trudeau in 68, 72, and 74, and it was time. And so she thought, who was available? She looked at some of the people who had been, a lot of the guys who wanted to be leader were, retreads from the Diefenbaker government, older guys, George Ease and Wallace McCutcheon. There was, Davy Fulton, Alvin Hamilton, Jack Horner, a bunch of people. And she said, well, she couldn't see any of them as a leader. She didn't think any of them were as progressive as she thought they should be. None of them were as progressive as Stanfield. And she said she didn't think that any of them were as good as she was. So she decided to run. And she became the second candidate to declare. She wanted to get in early so she wouldn't be looked on as an afterthought if the party said, well, we really should have a woman running too. She wanted to get in first early. So she was beaten to the post a little bit by Hugh Grafty, who's been a gadfly from Quebec. But he declared that she was very quickly declared, and she ran a very good campaign, but people promised to vote for her and didn't. Yeah. And it's called the Flora syndrome.
That particular leadership convention saw Joe Clark win the leadership, and then he was
Joe Clark.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say Joe Clark originally was supporting Flora. In her original organization meetings of her campaign, he was there, and then he decided to run for himself. But there was always a deal, an understanding, I guess, between Flora and Joe Clark that if one had to back out or was dropped from the ballot, the support would go to the other. So it was always known that. She was convinced that she would have more votes than Joe Clark.
Now, when Joe Clark became prime minister, he appointed Flora as one of the first secretaries of state for external affairs in the world. And being a female.
Right, female.
Tell us about some of the things that she accomplished in her short tenure in that position, because his government didn't last very long.
No, it sure didn't. Well, one of the things that she succeeded in doing was bringing in somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Vietnamese refugees following the Vietnam War. Canada, on a per capita basis, accepted far more Vietnamese refugees than any other country. The country got the Nansen Medal from the United Nations for its conspicuous service in the humanitarian cause for that national effort to bring in the refugees. And she proposed that. It started with, I think, 40,000 was the original target, and it gradually increased to about 80,000. And the deal became that any group of citizens or municipalities that wanted to bring in refugees, the federal government would match that and match money as well. So they got up, and by one count, by the time it was over, after she was out of office, it got to about 100,000 refugees, which was really quite remarkable. So she did that, over a lot of opposition within the Conservative caucus, because the Conservatives were not overly happy about refugees at that time. The Liberal Party was known as the party that favored immigration, and the Conservatives were not in those days. So she did that. The other thing, one of the other things, was when in 1979, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini. The crowd stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took most of the people, Americans there, hostage, took them as prisoners. Several escaped. There were 6 initially, and I think the 7th later on escaped and found their way to the Canadian embassy. Flora says that she was wakened up early one morning and was was told, could you please come to your parliamentary office as quickly as you can? She got there, and the officials from External Affairs were there and said, we have this message from the ambassador, Mr. Taylor in Tehran. Say, we have these Americans. He wants to offer them refuge. Will you agree? Of course, yes, I certainly will, but I have to clear it with the Prime Minister. So she went to the House of Commons. It was a Friday morning, so the House was sitting in the morning. Her seat was next to Joe Clark's. So he said, I need to see you when this is over. Question period is over. And they stayed behind, and she told him. And Clark said, absolutely. It's your ball, you carry it. Mm-hmm. It was her job to bring it in. So she got on to and got a hold of it, contacted the White House and told them what was going on. And then they worked on plans to get the hostages out, and it took quite a bit of time. The original Canadian plan put forward was not too acceptable to the CIA. It was the Canadian plan, which she had thought was really quite good, was to disguise these American refugees and as members of people from the oil industry who were in Iran looking for contracts and so on. And that probably would have worked, but the Americans were fancier, and so they decided to set it up as a film production operation based out of California. So anyway, that's what they ended up doing. But the key to the thing was to get them out, was to get them Canadian passports. Well, you really can't issue Canadian passports to people who aren't Canadian, except under exceptional circumstances, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or External Affairs can authorize the issue of extraordinary passports, but it requires cabinet approval to do so. Well, she got all the information and got the and went to Joe Clark and said, "Yeah, we'll do this, and I'll put it on the cabinet agenda, but I'm going to put it on the very last item on the agenda." And he knew what he was doing, and the cabinet was anxious to get out after a long cabinet meeting, and he got the last item, and Joe Clark said, "Oh, just wait, this one. There's one other item here from Flora. It's pretty routine. Can we just pass it?" And he said, "Oh yeah, let's pass it." So the cabinet approved it without actually knowing what it was. And then she had the passports. And the only problem they had with the passports was that the CIA buggered up the dates of the passport to show the people basically trying to leave the country before they'd arrived. And as the passports were written in Farsi, which nobody in External Affairs seemed to speak. But when the passports were sent from Ottawa to the Canadian Embassy in Tehran, they did notice, and they said, you can't do that. And they had to quickly alter the documents so that these people could get out, and they did.
Now, I don't want to run out of time here on the program because we haven't covered much of the other areas that we want to focus on. But in 1988, she lost her re-election bid to Peter Milliken, who went on to become Speaker of the House after several years in the House of Commons. After she lost that particular election, what did she decide to do with her life after that?
Well, she didn't really know what she wanted to do. Normally, in a situation like this, when a cabinet minister is defeated but the government's re-elected, as it was in this case, and Brian Mulroney was still prime minister again, usually the government takes care of defeated ministers. Ray Natish was a Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources in the first Mulroney cabinet, and he was from Saskatoon, and Brian Mulroney made him Governor General. That was his reward. Pretty well everybody got something, and some boards, a number of them went to the Senate, that sort of thing. Flora wasn't offered anything. And that was probably because she had difficult relations with Mulroney for some years. And and she said she wasn't going to ask him for anything, and she didn't expect him to ask him anything. Joe Clark became the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was prepared to appoint Flora High Commissioner in India, which she loved, India. But she didn't want to be a High Commissioner because then you've got a ceremonial office and you're following all the rules and the guidelines what you have to do as a national representative there. And she wanted to be able to have her own input and get involved in causes that interested her and make change in her own way.
Yeah.
And so she basically was not approached by Joe Clark, but let it be known that she was not interested at any rate. And then she just sort of waited, and she was invited at one point to go to Namibia as an election observer. She went with Care Canada to refugee camps in Africa. So she started doing that sort of work, and she got a freelance arrangement with World Vision for a program called North South, which aired I think about 5 times a year, and it was just before I went out to some hard done by part of the world and talked to people there and put together a program about that part of the world. And they did at refugee camps in various places and things of that sort. It got her the travel that she liked. It gave her some income. And while she was doing that, she got involved in other causes as well, not just World Vision, but in other things. And she did quite a lot of work with Care Canada. And then she got into some of the other humanitarian causes that were going on, both Canadian and foreign.
How did she get into Afghanistan? How did that all come about?
She got into Afghanistan because she was involved with a group called Future Generations International, which was operated by a chap by the name of Daniel Taylor, an American. She met Daniel Taylor in India at a reception, and she was there with one of her groups, and they started talking about Tibet, and Daniel Taylor was going to Tibet the following month, as I recall, and Flora said, "Oh my God, Tibet! The land of my dreams." She'd read all the books about Tibet and how exciting that was, the top of the world and all that stuff, and she was really excited. And Daniel Taylor said, "Well, if you're serious, be in I forgot where it was. I think it was in Nepal. They were meeting. Anyway, if you be there next month, and I'll take you." And so she did. I said, "Why not?" She said, "Why not?" So she's 55 years old, or there's something there. What else? So went off and did that, and toured Tibet within that time, and then went back a number of other times to Tibet. And then she got as she got more involved with Daniel Taylor and the Future Generations operation, she got involved in Tibet in the dealing with the big rivers that ran off the Tibetan plateau down into South Asia, the Mekong River and the Ganges, some of the others, and she became quite immersed in that kind of work. And then Daniel Taylor moved into Afghanistan to start doing some work there, basically working with people in the villages, high altitude work. It's all mountain type stuff. And she started with him there, and then his organization decided to pull out and concentrate on other areas. And she stayed and started her own organization to work in Afghanistan. She got.
Is this when the Russians were there, or after that?
No, the Taliban was just.
Okay.
The Taliban was just being driven out there, and she. I guess the very first time she went in, the Taliban was still in power, but then by the time that she got really immersed there, the Taliban was out, but like a constant threat. I mean, she was working in Bamiyan province in the high mountains in the middle, and that was the area where they had the place where they had that huge statue of the Buddha carved in the mountain, and the Taliban came and blew it up. Well, she was a very dangerous sort of place. But her focus was on mountain villages, basically dealing with women in those villages who were illiterate, by and large. A lot of them widowed because of the various wars that they went through, including the wars with the Taliban. And she was they were running courses to teach them to read and to write, teaching elements of agriculture, childcare, and that sort of stuff. That became her preoccupation. And she said she didn't stay in 5-star hotels anymore, or any hotels. She stayed in the huts of the villagers and played with their children and worked with them where they were, and quite often sleeping in a sleeping bag on somebody's floor.
She was a woman way ahead of her time.
Way ahead of her time, and really ahead of the women's movement as we know it today. Mm-hmm. I mean, she, in a sense, was a Canadian precursor of the Me Too movement, I suppose.
Interesting that we are talking about her as we record this particular conversation at the beginning of October. We are waiting for the next cabinet to come out of Ottawa with the anticipated gender equality approach to the cabinet, going back to the days when Flora was the only woman in a man's world. Interesting lady. All the best to you, and thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.
Geoff Stevens, who worked with Ms. MacDonald on her memoir, Flora, A Woman in a Man's World, and that book is now available. This episode was recorded in early October 2021 using Zoom.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast at gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.